There is a hole in a cliff of soft white marl, directly across a ravine from the ruins of Qumran, above the Dead Sea. Two black openings, cut by human hands. In August 1952, Bedouin found it before the archaeologists did. 15,000 fragments came out of that hole. 500 manuscripts. One of them, catalogued 4Q208, was written around 200 BCE, and it is not prophecy. It is solar data. It says the sun sets, then returns through the north. Officially, that is myth. But myths do not number their gates, count them, and pair them east to west. Start with the place, because the place is what everyone skips. Qumran sits on a dry plateau above the northwest corner of the Dead Sea. The cliff face below it is marl, chalky, crumbling, the kind of rock that erodes under a hand. Cave 4 is not a natural cavity, it was cut. 2 chambers dug into that soft wall, facing the settlement across a gully. You can stand on the plateau today and look straight at the openings. They are small. They are dark. And they held roughly 3/4 of everything ever recovered from the Qumran caves. The archaeologists were already excavating the ruins above when the Bedouin went into the cliff beneath them. By the time the official excavation started at the end of September 1952, most of it was already gone. What came out was not a library of neat scrolls. The wooden shelving inside had rotted centuries ago. The manuscripts collapsed with it. What survived arrived as 15,000 pieces of animal skin, some of them the size of a fingernail. All of them mixed together. That detail matters more than it sounds, because the fragments that came out of that hole were not sorted by importance. They were sorted by whoever could reassemble them. And one of the hardest, driest, least glamorous piles in that pile of debris turned out to be the oldest Enoch manuscript on Earth. Here is where people expect angels, watchers, giants, the fall. That is not what 4Q208 is. The script on 4Q208 dates to somewhere near 200 BCE. That makes it one of the oldest manuscripts found at Qumran. Older than most of the biblical copies people talk about. And its content is technical. It is Aramaic. It belongs to a work scholars now call the astronomical book, the section that survives in the Ethiopic Book of Enoch as chapters 72 through 82. 4 separate copies of it were in that cave. Not 1. 4. So the very oldest layer of Enoch we physically possess is not a vision of judgment. It is a document about where the sun goes. Now hold that, and look at what happened to the book afterward. Enoch was quoted by name in the New Testament. Jude, verses 14 and 15, cites it directly as prophecy. Early Christian writers knew it. Then it disappeared from the West almost completely. No Hebrew Bible, no Catholic canon, no Protestant canon, no Orthodox canon in Europe. The complete text survived in exactly one place on Earth. Ethiopia, in Ge'ez, where the Ethiopian and Eritrean Orthodox Tewahedo tradition kept it as full scripture and never stopped. That is not a conspiracy. That is a fact of transmission. But sit with the shape of it. A book good enough to quote in the New Testament and gone from every Bible in Europe for over 1,000 years. It came back by accident. In 1773, a Scottish traveler named James Bruce returned from 6 years in Abyssinia carrying 3 Ge'ez copies. One went to the Bodleian in Oxford. One went to the Royal Library in Paris. One he kept. They sat unread for decades. In 1821, Richard Lawrence published the first English translation from the Oxford manuscript. So until 200 years ago, the English-speaking world had no idea what chapter 72 actually said. Read it and tell me it sounds like doctrine. The luminary the sun has its rising in the eastern portals of the heaven, and its setting in the western portals of the heaven. And I saw 6 portals in which the sun rises, and 6 portals in which the sun sets. 6 and 6. Not many, not countless, not a poetic infinity. 6 openings in the east, 6 in the west, paired directly opposite each other, 1 facing 1, 2 facing 2. And then he adds something a symbol has no reason to have. Also many windows to the right and left of these portals. Smaller openings, flanking the larger ones. That is not how metaphor usually behaves. Metaphor does not subdivide. Now look at the verbs, because the verbs are the crime scene. I saw. He rises in the great portal, which is the fourth. He comes forth through that fourth portal 30 mornings in succession, and sets accurately in the fourth portal in the west of the heaven. Then he moves to the fifth portal for 30 mornings. Then the sixth, comes forth through, sets accurately in 30 mornings in succession. That is not the grammar of prophecy. That is the grammar of a logbook. Position, count, repetition, position again. Somebody is recording where a light appears against a fixed line, day after day, and tracking how far along that line it has moved. And then he answers the question no myth in the ancient world bothered to answer this way. Most ancient cultures had an explanation for the night. The sun died. The sun was swallowed. The sun sailed an underworld river and fought something in the dark. Enoch does none of that. Chapter 72, verse 5. The chariot on which he ascends, the wind drives, and the sun goes down from the heaven and returns through the north in order to reach the east, and is so guided that he comes to the appropriate portal. Returns through the north. No death, no underworld, no rebirth. A route, a direction. The sun sets in the west, travels north, and comes back around to re-enter through the correct gate on the eastern side. The writer isn't telling you what the night means. He's telling you which way the thing went. And he keeps adding conditions. The disk is quite filled with illuminating and heating fire. It gives light and it gives heat, listed as two separate properties. Wind drives the chariot, and later, flatly, it neither slackens nor rests, but runs on in its chariot by day and by night. Fire, heat, wind, continuous motion, never stopping. That is not imagery. That is a conditions report. Here is what the mainstream reading says, and I want to give it properly because it is not stupid. Scholars have long argued that the astronomical book is schematic ancient cosmology, heavily indebted to Babylonian astronomical traditions, dressed in Jewish angelic framing. The archangel Uriel is the tour guide. The gates are a literary architecture of heaven. The numbers are idealized, not observed. Early commentators were brutal about it. Robert Charles, one of the great translators of Enoch, called the choice of the calendar in this book stupidity. Otto Neugebauer, one of the most important historians of ancient science who ever lived, considered the astronomy in it primitive next to what the Babylonians were actually doing. Clean explanation. Old myth, borrowed math, no observation. That explanation works right up until you ask what the gates are for, because Enoch's system produces a year, a specific one, 364 days, divided into 4 quarters of 91 days each. Day and night lengths shift month by month in fixed ratios as the sun moves from gate to gate. The sun spends 30 mornings in the 4th gate, then the 5th, then the 6th, then turns and comes back down the line. That is not decorative, that is a working instrument. And crucially, that number, 364, is a polemic. It is set against the 360-day schematic year of Mesopotamian tradition. Somebody added 4 days on purpose and built a whole gate system to justify them. You don't build a machine that precise to illustrate a spiritual truth. And now the part that changes the stakes, because it is about the manuscript itself, and it is the reason the story doesn't end here. The version you can read, the Ethiopic, the one Bruce carried out of Abyssinia, the one Lawrence translated, the one in every paperback Book of Enoch on the internet, is not the original. The Aramaic copies from Cave 4 are longer, substantially longer, and substantially different. What survives in Ge'ez chapters 72 through 82 is an abridgment of something bigger. The Aramaic contained material the Ethiopic simply does not have, including what looks like a full synchronistic calendar, tracking the moon against the sun across a multi-year cycle in relentless numerical detail. Read that again. The oldest copy is bigger than the surviving one. Everything you have ever read about Enoch's son is a summary of a document nobody can now fully reconstruct. And it gets worse, because of how it survived. Those Aramaic copies are the debris from a collapsed shelf in a marl cave. scholars working on 4Q208 and 4Q209 have said openly that the fragments are too broken to recover the complete gate theory from the Aramaic alone. There is a rare Aramaic word in 4Q209, read by some as describing small openings inside each gate, the individual daily positions where the sun rose. If that reading is right, the system was even finer than the Ethiopic suggests. 12 gates, each subdivided into daily slots. If the word is disputed, the fragment is torn, the line does not survive intact. The single most physically specific detail in the whole system sits on a piece of skin that is not fully there. So who was allowed to work on it? This is the part of the story that is genuinely about hiding, and I want to be precise because it does not need exaggeration. From the 1950s onward, the unpublished Cave 4 material was assigned to a small, closed group of scholar editors. Not a public archive, not open access, a team. Outsiders could not see the photographs. For roughly 40 years, that arrangement held, while the publication rate crawled and the accusations got uglier. Critics called it a cartel. The editors said the handwriting was simply that hard. It broke in September 1991, when the Huntington Library in California announced it would open its complete set of scroll photographs, around 3,000 negatives, to any qualified scholar. The authorities in Israel were furious. Legal threats followed. Weeks later, a facsimile edition of previously unpublished photographs appeared anyway. The monopoly was over. 4 decades. That is not a rumor. That is the documented publishing history of the most important manuscript find of the 20th century. And the astronomical book fragments? They were not properly published in the official series until 2000. A full critical edition with commentary did not appear until 2011. 59 years between the moment those pieces came out of that hole in the marl and the moment the world could actually read them. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is where these stories usually collapse. There is no evidence anyone locked away Enoch's solar text because of what it said. The delay covered thousands of fragments across every category. The stated reason, that shattered manuscripts take decades to reconstruct, is true. But intent and effect are different things. The effect was that for 2 full generations, the oldest surviving account of where the sun goes at night was physically unreadable by anyone outside a closed circle. And when it finally opened, it turned out to describe something you can walk outside and watch. Here is the thing nobody tells you about sunrise. The sun does not rise in the same place every day. Its rising point migrates along the horizon across the year, north in summer, south in winter, then stops, turns, and comes back. That reversal is the solstice. The full sweep, from one extreme to the other and back, is an arc. A fixed, repeating, measurable arc against whatever landscape happens to be sitting on your eastern skyline. Which is exactly what Enoch's gates describe. 6 positions in the east. The sun occupying one for 30 mornings, then shifting to the next, reaching the extreme, and turning back down the line. That is not an idealized diagram of heaven. That is what horizon astronomy looks like when you write it down. And people did build it. On a ridge in coastal Peru stands a site called Chunquillo. 13 stone towers, spaced along the crest of a hill, deliberately constructed so that from a fixed observation point, the sun rises between them at different positions through the year. It is a solar calendar made of physical gates on a physical horizon. It was recognized by UNESCO in 2021 as an astronomical observatory of the ancient world. Different continent, no contact, no shared tradition, same idea. Numbered openings on a skyline, used to count the year. That does not mean Enoch was describing Chunquillo. It does not mean a Judean scribe built towers in the desert. What it means is narrower and far more uncomfortable. The thing Enoch describes is a functional design, not a fantasy. When another culture, on its own, needed to track the solar year against the ground, it produced the same architecture the text puts in the sky. The metaphor reading survives that. But it stops being the obvious answer. And then there is the view from the plateau itself. Stand at Qumran and look east. You are looking across the Dead Sea. On the far side, the Moab escarpment rises out of the water, a long, hard wall of rock forming the eastern skyline. When the sun comes up there, it comes up along that ridge. And across the year, the point where it clears that ridge slides north, stops, and slides back. I am not going to tell you the people at Qumran measured that ridge and called the notches gates. There is no evidence of that. Nobody has found a marker, an alignment, an observation platform, a single line of text saying so. Anyone who claims otherwise is filling a hole with a story. But the community that kept 4 copies of a book about 6 eastern gates lived on a plateau facing a natural eastern wall where the sun's rising point moves exactly the way that book says it moves. You are allowed to sit with that. Now read the last part of the text, because the writer already knew his system would fail. 364 days is wrong. The real solar year is a little over 365. Enoch's calendar drifts, roughly a day and a quarter every year, which means within a couple of decades your festivals are in the wrong season and your gates no longer match the sky. Any working astronomer would notice that within a lifetime. So what does the book do? Chapter 80. It says that in the days of the sinners the order breaks, the years grow shorter, the moon changes its course, the stars leave their paths, the rain is withheld and the fruit comes late, the luminaries themselves go wrong. Look at what just happened. The text has an error, and instead of correcting the model, it declares that the sky has gone off course. Some scholars read that as pure theology. Moral collapse mirrored in cosmic disorder, a standard apocalyptic move. Others read it as an ancient acknowledgement of exactly the drift the writer could see building. That argument is not settled, but either way, the structure is chilling. The document contains its own alibi. When the gates stopped lining up, it wasn't the gates that were wrong. It was the world. So where does that leave the file? We have a hand-cut hole in a marl cliff above the Dead Sea. We have 4 Aramaic copies of a solar text pulled out of it. The oldest written around 200 BCE, older than most of the biblical manuscripts from the same cave. We have a book erased from every Western canon and kept alive in one country, in one language, for 1,000 years. We have a passage that gives you 6 gates east, 6 gates west, smaller windows flanking them, 30 mornings per position, fire and heat and wind, and a night route that runs through the north. We have an original that is longer than the version everyone reads, torn precisely where the finest detail lives. We have 4 decades in which almost nobody could examine it, and 59 years before it was fully published. And we have a real horizon that behaves like the text says it behaves. None of that proves there are doors on the edge of the world. It doesn't. The mainstream reading, schematic cosmology, borrowed and idealized, is still standing. It is just no longer the only thing standing. Because the text did not change, not once. The Aramaic from that cave says what it said in 200 BCE. The Ge'ez that Ethiopian scribes copied by hand for centuries says what it said. Every word survived. What changed was us, what we decided those words were allowed to mean, and how long we were willing to leave them in a drawer. Go back to the cliff. The marl is still crumbling. The 2 openings are still there, black against pale rock, small enough to miss from the plateau if nobody points them out. The chambers inside are empty now. Everything they held has been counted, numbered, photographed, argued over, and locked behind glass. And out beyond them, past the salt haze, the Moab wall catches the light. Tomorrow it will catch it a fraction further along the ridge, then a fraction further, until it stops, turns, and comes back down the line. 30 mornings. Then the next position. Exactly the way something wrote it down, in Aramaic, on a piece of skin that somebody carried into a hole in a cliff and left in the dark.